Hello everyone, I'm day weather meteorologist Don Day with your Public Lands Council weekly weather update for this June 24th, 2023. It's being brought to you by Ag Risk Advisors and WSR Insurance Services Incorporated. Well, it's hard to believe we're about ready to go into the last days of June. And for some of you, it's been very hot. For many of you, it's been, well, cooler than average and still wet in many areas. As we go through the last 7 days of the month, this is what we're going to continue to see. Texas and the southern plains, namely New Mexico, Texas, parts of the Gulf Coast, will be very, very hot and humid still. Now, I do see as we get into early July that heat breaking a little bit, but for another week, it's going to be very hot down there. We're going to continue to also see moderate temperatures in the central and northern Rockies, the Pacific Northwest, and the Great Basin. Moderate meaning temperatures will be close to their averages, maybe even a little bit below average. We have continued to see more shower and thunderstorm activity and wet conditions in the western high plains and parts of the central and northern Rockies, especially just along and east of the Continental Divide. And we continue to see dryness continuing in the Corn Belt. So it's almost like the pattern overall is about the same. As we go into the next week, I think that's really how it's going to go, about the same. So what has occurred over this past week will be somewhat similar to what we're going to see over the next week. Now, it has turned drier west of the divide on the western slope of Colorado back into Utah, the western side of the divide into the Great Basin. Conditions have started to dry out a bit, which is actually typical for late June, and that trend will continue. But even then, some shower and thunderstorm activity as we transition out of June into early July could be taking place. Over the last week, the continued area that trends southeast to the northwest in this area here continues to be the most wet. You can see that along and east of the divide is where the heavier moisture has been across Montana, the western Dakotas, many areas of Wyoming, and many areas of eastern Colorado and Kansas, central and areas of western Nebraska. We've had a little bit of western Corn Belt rain, but look at the central Corn Belt over the last week, nearly nothing right there. So continue to be dry. We still don't see signs of that summer monsoon thunderstorm pattern in Arizona and New Mexico yet, and we don't expect any for another week, at least of any consequence. Now, when you take a look at the latest drought monitor, we continue to see remarkable improvement year to year. While we still are fighting drought conditions in eastern and central Nebraska, many areas of Kansas into Missouri into Iowa, and that dryness expanding now further into the Corn Belt, if you were to look really from the western high plains westward, this area right here has still got some dry areas, but let's take a look at where we were a year ago. This is the current drought monitor. A year ago, look at all the red and the brown in California, the southwestern United States, the Rockies, and look where it is now. Basically, in a year, the drought has been erased, or most of it has, and the drought areas now are much smaller. There in portions of Nebraska and Kansas. So still got some drought areas to be concerned about, and that will be a concern going through the rest of the summer, but a big improvement over a year ago. And you can see that in the latest soil moisture ranking in terms of the green areas showing above average soil moisture, while the white areas are near average. And then you take a look at the brown areas. This is where we continue to have concerns, and I think we will through the rest of the summer, as this area being persistently dry. Starting to see some dryness in the Pacific Northwest. That's not a big concern yet, but look at the Rockies, California, into the southwest United States, still looking at a surplus soil moisture profile, doing pretty good. Now, over the last week, we know that Texas has grabbed a lot of headlines for good reason. Look at the heat in Mexico and Texas and southern New Mexico. Warmer than average conditions in Canada and the upper Midwest, but most of the country in the east and southeast, and certainly most of the country and most of North America, in this area here, has had another cooler than average week of weather. So actually, when you look at the colder areas and the warmer areas, it's about a draw in terms of how the heat has gone so far in June. And the persistent cooler than average conditions in the west, I think, will take us through the rest of the month. Now, speaking of that forecast, this is where we're going to be this weekend. We have a low moving across the northern plains, so Montana, the Dakotas will continue to see a good chance of rain, showers and thunderstorms in the east, and of course the really hot weather in Texas, New Mexico, and parts of the desert southwest. Now, this heat dome will gradually build and expand northward and drift a little bit westward over the next week or so. Also expect some windy areas in parts of Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana as this pattern shifts and things begin to move around a bit. Now, this is by next weekend, the first weekend of July. Notice the high pressure ridge is a little more west now. So that may ease a little bit of the heat in Texas, but it'll still be muggy and warm with some shower and thunderstorm activity across the northern tier and eastern areas of the United States. Over the next week, this is where the precipitation is going to be. Look how wet it's going to be from Montana and northern Wyoming across portions of the northern plains and getting to parts of the Corn Belt. Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and eastern Nebraska picking up some needed rain. Now, it doesn't look as wet here as it's been, and I think that will end up being the case as some drier air from the deserts does get pushed in here to parts of the southern plains, kind of knocking down the chance for showers and storms. But the northern areas still looking very wet over the next week or so. Have yourself a good week ahead. We'll see you next weekend.